So, hello again. In this video, I wanted to point out a few limitations of using the snapshot approach of FMOD for reverb. I'm gonna do that in Unity because I just feel a bit more comfortable in there, but all the principles we're talking about are still working in Unreal. So, the first problem I want to point out is that, as we've seen in previous videos, when we're walking in and out of a reverb zone, even with a small envelope, the fade in and out doesn't really feel that natural. To point that out, I'm gonna re-enter my scene real quick. Especially thinking about like a limit like this, where I'm already really close to my reverb room and still I don't hear anything at all. To underline that a bit more, I've implemented the gunshot to maybe have a more loud sound, which underlines how weird it feels to not hear any reverb at all. The second problem I want to point out is that snapshots are linked to our mixer logic. With that meaning, we're sort of limited in how the location of the player or any other entity influences the sound of the reverb we're hearing. So at the moment we have our character bus, which the sounds are automated via the snapshots. But if we're thinking of an additional monster running around in our scene, and it could be either in our reverb zone or out of it, we either throw it into our character bus and then the reverb is linked whether the character is in the same reverb zone as the monster or not, or we would need another bus just for the monster entities for which we would automate the sense. The problem with that is that all monsters would be influenced by the same bus, so it's not really working for a scene where the same type of entity, or speaking in Unity terms, the prefab would be running around inside a cave and outside of it. To quickly demonstrate the effects of what I'm talking about, I'm gonna drop the monster into the character bus, quickly build the bank, and I threw in a cube which has a monster grunting sound attached to it. So, as long as we're, as a player, standing outside of the cave, we're hearing the monster without reverb, and just the moment we're stepping in as a player, the grunting or snoring or whatever gets drenched in reverb. The second, or well, weird option would be to throw the monster event outside of the character bus. And as we see when we're clicking on the room snapshot, we're not able to make any changes to the event itself. It already points out select the bus above to view its effect chain, so snapshot changes only work for buses. So for that I'm going to present two solutions, but I already want to point out that both of them are at least a bit more complicated, and in the next videos I'm going to cover how Wise, as like middleware alternative, is handling reverb, and as well how you could use the Meta SDK right in FMOD, which offers a great way for sort of specialized reverb as well. So the solution I'm presenting is mostly for people who want to stick with FMOD and use all its capabilities without having an other plugin maybe messing with the setups they're already using. So regarding our first problem, how we could get smoother fades in and out of those reverb zones, I'm gonna quickly remove our cute monster again from our scene, and I first want to introduce the approach we're gonna take. Because at the moment, there's just this trigger box which is supposed to be right at the size of the container, which is triggering the reverb. So we're gonna change that into having a bit of a bigger zone, which is already active before we are in the reverb zone itself. And we're gonna have an additional box, which gives us the opportunity to calculate how far away we are from the actual reverb zone while we're already in the trigger box, which triggered the snapshot. I hope it gets a bit more clear when I'm showing the example. So the first step to that is we're increasing the size of that container box. Specifically, I want to increase the X scale because we mostly want to hear the reverb when we're in front of it, like at the sides of the container. It would feel a little weird, I'd say, to have already that strong of a reverb because you would expect to hear it from the entrance and exit. Then we're gonna add basically a second type of this trigger box. Gonna throw that in the same parent GameObject and just call it inner box. And I'm going to give it a box collider as well. And the next thing we need is a small, really small script I already prepared to quickly have a look. We first of all have our emitter. To not get confused, this is the component we added to the container to simply start our snapshot event when we're entering that box. We need that because even the emitter is internally providing an instance which will then change a parameter of. The next thing is basically the location of us as a player, so we can calculate the distance to. And the next thing is the outer trigger box we're triggering the snapshot to, because that script is currently on our inner trigger box. And in start, there's not happening anything at all. The important thing is basically we're using Unity's internal closest point method to get the closest point from our listener to the outer trigger box and then calculate the distance as a vector from our listener's position to that closest point. We then set a parameter for that instance of the snapshot, being named distance to snapshot, with the value we just calculated. Back in the Unity inspector, we quickly need to set all of those relations, so I'm gonna quickly drop those in. Perfect. That's it for now in Unity, so we're gonna quickly switch back to FMOD. As I've already teasered, we need to create a new parameter, so parameter browser, and as you'll see, it's already there in my session. It's simply a continuous parameter being named distance to snapshot. Currently, I use the values 0 to 8, but as those are game units and distances, it's strongly dependent on your individual game. As an addition, you might think why we're not using the built-in distance. The problem with that is that the distance is calculating the distance to the point of the snapshot instance itself. And as the snapshot instance is only playing at a specific point inside of our reverb zone, we would have a point inside our reverb zone which we're calculating the distance to. By using that two trigger boxes approach, we're basically calculating the distance to our reverb zone. Perfect. And now basically the last thing we need to do is when we click on our room snapshot, we can right-click the intensity knob and add an automation and link that to the distance to snapshot. So, gonna quickly throw in something like this. And with that setup, that basically means the overall intensity gets stronger or less strong the further away we are. So we're basically fading in our snapshot over distance to the snapshot. Okay, back to Unity. One thing I quickly need to correct, we need to place the inner trigger box on the script I just presented to calculate the distance to that inner trigger box as a listener. So now to quickly present what we've been up to. So at the moment we don't have any reverb at all. I'm gonna show the console as well because it's printing the distance to the reverb zone. Nice. And lastly, as a quick addition, it's actually possible that we sort of spatialize our whole reverb. This may sound a bit confusing, but if we think about space, we are as humans able to track where the space and the reverb of that is coming from. So for example, if we imagine our capsule standing in front of this container but looking in this direction, we would be able to hear the reverb from our left side, and with that even be able to localize the container that it's to the left of us, which could be quite handy in the sense of tracking your environment in video games. So I quickly want to show a sort of hacky workaround to make that work in FMOD. For that, we actually need to basically rework our whole setup. First, we remove our whole automation from the intensity slider with the distance we had before and change that to automate our send dial directly. I want to add, this is actually a possibility from the very start, so you don't need to automate the intensity slider. It just normally is a really nice way to blend the whole effect of these snapshots in and out. For example, if you're using filtering, etc., that would be blended in and out as well. But as we're now will be panning our reverb, automating the intensity sort of messes with FMOD's internally panning, and that doesn't result in the effect we want. So I'm gonna quickly draw in that curve to basically simulate the effect we had before. If we're closer to the box, we want more reverb. I want to point out this is sort of exaggerated because you probably wouldn't dial in 0 dB of a reverb on that send, but it's a bit easier to hear the effect if we have a more extreme reverb. Nice. Then the second thing we need is now a new parameter. As FMOD provides this internal direction parameter, we can just use this. Just called built-in direction, and the moment you select it, the parameter name is automatically set to direction. Already have that set up, so it's direction 2 here. And you can just press OK, and then you have that direction parameter. Basically what it does is it tracks the position of the listener and the event relative to each other. And if we look at the values we're able to get, they range from -180 to 180, with 0 being right in front of you and 180 at the back of you and -180 as well at the back of you, circling around you in different directions. So we're going to use that to actually automate the panning of our whole reverb bus. This may sound a bit hacky and scuffed, and I will point out some problems with that afterwards. So we first need to change, because yeah, my setup is defaulting to stereo, but we need the surround panner, so I'm just gonna switch to the highest one available. And first, to quickly understand that panner window, we have that direction parameter, which is basically doing what I just explained, cycling from 0 degrees right in front of you to 180, then suddenly jumping to minus 180 and back to 0. So we're automating that with our direction and basically just mapping it as we would expect. So we mirror that movement. The second thing we need is the extent, which basically means how extreme is our panning, or on how many speakers as well as it's spreading. And we want our panning sort of to be more extreme when we're further away, so we're able to track the reverb to a more concrete position. So for that, we're going to use our distance to snapshot parameter and just automating it with that. I'm actually, for the sake of making it more extreme, setting it up that it's slowly fading in, and the moment we're really close, it's basically, yeah, sort of suddenly surrounding you. So we have a more panned reverb when we're further away, and basically just on a few steps when we're closer to the box, we want our reverb to be panned. Perfect. Quick background information why this is working. As we've seen before, the snapshots are internally handled as FMOD events. Normally, the direction parameter is an information about the FMOD event, so you get like information where sound is coming from in 3D space. But as the snapshot itself is basically an FMOD event, we get that direction information as well. So we can use the information where the snapshot is placed in our 3D space to pan our reverb accordingly. I want to point out that it's really important to use that distance to snapshot variable or parameter which we set up before, and not FMOD's internal distance parameter, which can be found here under built-in distance, because when we look back in our Unity scene, the snapshot itself is basically just at the very center of this box. So we would approach even further to that reverb and don't have that panning to the whole box, but to that specific point inside of the box. We quickly gonna have a look inside of FMOD so I can preview what this is doing. For this, I'm going to loop my gunshot, and actually in the mixer itself, outside of the snapshot, I'm going to mute the gunshot itself, so we're just hearing the reverb, and then when I'm playing the gunshot, we see that there is signal coming in, but we hear nothing as we muted the output. And when we're now activating the reverb and increasing the distance, I'm gonna switch to this view because then we can see the panner. And when we're closer, we are more surrounded by the reverb. Just as a quick addition, the reverb was a lot quieter when we were further away. This is because of the automation we set up for the send over here. And then we're entering Unity again to quickly see how this is working. Again, I'm quickly going to do the same thing as I did before with live updates, muting the original sound, so we're just hearing the reverb. Gonna bring up the original sound again. As I said before, reverb amount is quite extreme, so you probably would dial that down a little bit, but that really gives a sort of spatial sense, because you can now hear there's something spatial going on at the left side of our view. Nice. Lastly, to point out limitations of this approach, as I said, this is really hacky, as FMOD is basically using a mixer console approach where you send in to reverb buses, etc., and are not actually referring to spatial rooms inside of the game world. So as we're panning the whole mixer bus, we're sort of getting complications if we're using the same snapshot in the same scene close to each other. So the same snapshot would try to pan the return bus in multiple ways and basically, destroying the whole panning feeling at all. So this approach should either be used with one return bus per reverb you want to use in your scene at the same time, or the probably sadder solution is to simply don't use this approach at all if you want to use the same reverb for multiple entities in your scene at the same time. So again, to make a clear example, if we imagine this is like a shooter map or something, and this is a container where you're able to hide inside, it would be totally possible to have that same container like once more over here. So then the snapshots would already, mess with each other. I'm quickly gonna build that and to demonstrate the acoustic properties of that and how FMOD handles that. So as we can see, now we have those two containers opposite of each other with those trigger zones overlapping. So to quickly have a listen on how badly that works. Yeah, as I said, we're basically sadly losing a majority of the effect and rather confusing the player than giving him any useful information. And now to the second problem, that we want the entities or monsters or whatever in our scene to be aware of the current environment they're in, and with that, the reverb. So for this, I slightly configured our existing scene and added a movement script to this cube monster, which basically moves it back and forth. So we have a bit of a movement of that entity to simulate, I don't know, some monster walking back and forth in and out of that container. Secondly, I'm going to mute the effects of the snapshot we've set up in the first half of the video. So we're not gonna take some effects we've set up for the snapshot for the other things we will now set up, but I want to point out those two approaches are totally combinable. So it's not you have to take either that approach or the other. Just to make the effects more clear, we're going to set up. Nice. The overall approach we're going to take is that we're going to set up parameters in FMOD itself for all the possible reverbs any entity can be in. So, for example, we have in cave and in room, corresponding to the current return reverb tracks we have. And with those, we will be modulating the send on each individual event. So if we look on monster growling, I already added a send to the reverb room return bus and just basically map that continuous parameter of 0 to 1 to increase over the value range. This results in higher send to the reverb return when that value is higher. So in Unity, we now just need to communicate when the value needs to have which, when the parameter needs to have which value. So there are basically two different approaches for setting the parameter value in Unity now. For both of them, we need to assign corresponding tags to our trigger boxes, which we've already set up. So for our inner box, which is basically just the trigger box around our container, I already created corresponding tags. I'm gonna select the room reverb for that box. So the first approach we're going to take is to use the FMOD component, the FMOD Studio parameter trigger, which basically instantly sets a value for a parameter for a specified event instance. So we can just drag in the Studio event emitter, set the trigger to trigger enter, the collision tag to room reverb, and then we can see all the parameters which are currently used on the event. So if I would have had more parameters on that event, there would have been more parameters to select from. So you sort of need to be aware which one you want to set. And when we enter that trigger box, we want that value to be 1. And same thing when we exit the corresponding trigger box. So we basically do the same thing again, just with trigger exit this time, same collision tag, and setting the value to 0. So to quickly have a listen to how our monster now sounds. As before, it's sort of abrupt. So the moment we're entering the trigger zone, we're in the reverb. The moment we're out of it, we're totally dry again. So one solution similar to the envelope we had on the intensity slider of the snapshot before is to use FMOD's seek function as modulation, which is new in FMOD 2.03. which allows us to make value changes on our parameter, or either the parameter or the actual send, not instant, but make them happen more smoothly. So that may already at least smooth out some of the sudden changes. But I want to present another solution similar to the approach thing we've set up for our player. We can use something similar for each entity. So I'm going to remove that modulation again, and then we go back to Unity. One additional setup we need to do is that we need our outer trigger box to have a tag as well. So I've just named that outer reverb box. Keep in mind that you might want to have different tags for different reverb settings you might want to use. The script I'm going to show is still going to work if you have the same tag for everything. It's just, might be a bit confusing on the long run. So we're going to remove the FMOD Studio parameter triggers from our cube monster, or how you might have named it, and add one other script I've already prepared. So we're quickly going to have a look in that one. The main idea here is basically the same than we had for our player script. So we're referring to our studio event emitter, which is again the component we've set up on our GameObject in Unity. Then we have the inner box and the outer box as box colliders. Then we have the parameter we want to change in in FMOD. So that's going to be the in-room parameter over here. Then this is going to be used whether or not we want to use or if we want to do our calculations, because if we're not inside our outer trigger box, we're not going to compute anything because there's not going to be any reverb at all. And then, as I've said before, we need that outer box tag so we know what we need to check for. So, as well, there's the collider of our object itself, which is going to be set in the start function, and we can specify an update rate, meaning in terms of optimization, we might not need to update our reverb parameter every frame, but for example, every 200 milliseconds is totally fine already. So in our start function, we're basically setting the tag of that outer box, getting the collider of the GameObject the script is on, and starting our coroutine, which is just replacing the update function, as we can use our own update rate for that. Then, as I've said before, we're using the bool value of isInsideTrigger to know whether we want to update the spatialization of the reverb. This value is just set with our onTrigger enter and onTrigger exit, and this is as well the reason why we even need the tag, so we can check if our GameObject entered the outer trigger box or left it. Nice. Then quickly to the core function of the whole script. Basically first checking if we have any values which are not valid or not set, so we don't make any computations which might crash the script or anything. As before, then we're getting the closest point to our inner box, but the addition which we now have to make is that we need to calculate the distance from our GameObject to the closest point of the bounds of the outer box. This may sound a little confusing, but we're basically getting the closest point as well, just that the GameObject is inside that outer box as well. So we're in need of some other function because we cannot use the closest point function. So Unity provides us with that physics.compute penetration. And with that, we're just getting the distance to our outer box. Then we're calculating the total distance between our closest point to the inner box and the closest point from our GameObject to the outer box to have some sort of percentage of our total distance. And that value is basically used to set our parameter. I added a small debug line so we can quickly see how those values will look like before we send them to FMOD. So with that script added, we quickly need to assign all of those components. So the parameter name is, as I've said, in room. For our use case in here, then that's our studio event emitter. That's the inner box, and that's the outer box. I try to keep the script as flexible as possible, so there's still the opportunity to have different inner and outer boxes and just not fully hard code them, so you can reuse that script in some other projects and use cases, maybe with a different name than Spatialize Monster. So now with this setup, this basically allows us that our cube monster is, depending on where it's in that outer range of that box, between the inner box and the outer box, fading in our reverb and fading it out automatically. So, to quickly have a listen again. Quickly as addition, as I said, here we can now see how those values are being set. So we have our distance to the inner box, distance to outer box, and the percentage. So when it's 1, we have our maximum value fully sent into that reverb, and now we're fading out. And you sometimes see that it's stopping to update those values, and that is because we've basically stopped computation when we're outside of that outer trigger box. So with that, we're just trying to save some CPU. Cool. So to sum things up again, in this video we covered how both for the player using snapshots and for other monsters and their specific events with sense on each event, there's the possibility to fade in and out reverb and not have sudden changes. And with those smooth changes, even with the possibility to make those adjusted to the actual environment and have custom trigger boxes which allow us to fade in and out of the reverb depending on where we are, corresponding to our actual reverb zone. This is still, as you might notice, some sort of hacky solution sometimes, because we're still having reverb return buses which are not representing actual reverbs inside our game world. So in the next video, I'm going to cover the Meta plugin for FMOD, which actually computes the whole reverb of your actual game world, which is quite amazing. And in the last video, as like a bonus video, I'm quickly going to cover the reverb possibilities in Wwise as FMOD's direct competitor. So hope you're still interested, and see you in the next one.